All right, kia ora tēnā koutou, ko Izzy toka wingawa. Welcome, my name is Izzy and I'm Engagement Director for the Aotearoa Circle. I hope everyone here and their whānau are doing well or as well as they can in their bubble. I was saying earlier, I take my hat off to any parents on this call or any small business owners. I know these are challenging times, so kudos to you. I am in no position to complain since I am neither of those things, but there is a 40% chance of a guest appearance from my 9-month-old German Shepherd puppy. My wife has promised she will do her best to keep him entertained for the next 45 minutes, so we'll see how we go. A little bit of housekeeping. You've all been put on mute just for efficiency's sake, but we want you to use the chat function if you've got any questions throughout the session. I'm going to be keeping an eye on that. Jess is going to be keeping an eye on that, and nothing gets past Vicky Watson. I'm sure she'll let me know if I miss anything as well. So feel free to get in there with any questions. This is session 2 in the Circle's new web series. We're really just trying to create more opportunities for engagement and visibility around the work that's coming out of the Circle. If there's anything in particular anyone is really keen to hear about, let me know. At this point, the next session is going to be on the marine adaptation strategy and an update on sort of where that is at. Today, we've asked Nicola Swan from our wonderful partners, Chapman Tripp, to talk us through the legal opinions that she and Daniel Curtimes have done for us, and in particular, what has changed since the 2019 opinion. Nicola is partner in the litigation dispute resolution team at Chapman Tripp in Wellington, and particular expertise in advising boards and executive teams on climate change risk management. Nicola returned from the UK to New Zealand in late 2019, which is very lucky timing, both for Nicola to miss the pandemic, but also for the Aotearoa Circle to benefit from her expertise. So thank you for that choice and timing, Nicola. Nicola is working on a number of entities that are managing climate change financial risk, as well as others required to report under the incoming climate risk reporting legislation. Nicola is acting on climate change related litigation in New Zealand and co-authored with Daniel, as I mentioned earlier, the Aotearoa Circle's 2019 opinion on director and fund managers' duties to manage climate risk, and then also the Aotearoa Circle's toolkit for directors on managing climate risk. So that's a little intro on Nicola. We're really excited to have you sharing this piece with us today. I will hand it over to you for now.
Thanks, Izzy. Kia ora koutou. It's really delightful to be here and see so many lovely people joining in the midst of lockdown. I'm one of those people with small children, so we'll keep our fingers crossed that they don't enter the webinar with us. But so we thought it would be really useful just to talk through the work that Daniel Curtimes and I have done in the last year or so, following on from the legal opinion that we did at the end of 2019, which focused on director and fund manager duties to manage climate-related financial risk. And this time, the opinion focuses on trustee duties to manage climate-related financial risk. And so we thought to keep things exciting on a mid-lockdown webinar, we would throw a few slides together. So I'm just going to share my screen and you can all jump in and see that. So that should be up with you now. Awesome. And the key question that we were looking at was whether New Zealand trustees were permitted or required to address climate-related financial risk when managing trust investments. I'm just going to get my slides up so that I can see easily into the camera. There we go. Perfect. So what we needed to look at for this opinion, which was quite different to the opinion we did for duties on directors and fund managers, was the key duties on trustees, in particular under the new Trusts Act, which was passed in 2019 and came into force from the beginning of 2021. So it's quite an exciting time to be doing an opinion on trustee duties because of that new piece of legislation, which has really brought together a lot of trust law in New Zealand under sort of one new and improved piece of legislation. And the key duties for us are the duties of trustees to manage investments prudently, which is a statutory duty that derives from common law, the duty to act in the best interests of the beneficiaries and to act for a proper purpose at all times, and then the duty to act impartially as between beneficiaries. And it's really the intersection of those three duties which has made this piece of work so interesting, because all of those duties come together, we have seen in the way that requires them to manage climate-related financial risk. And we looked at two questions. One was, are trustees permitted to take into account climate change when they're managing trust investments? And then are trustees actually required to take into account climate change? And really the short answer to all of this is very similar to where we came out in terms of director and fund manager duties, albeit that's under a completely separate statutory and common law context, and that is that where the impact on the investments of a trust from climate change have the potential to be material. So if you have a main investment of the trust, which is a property, and that property is exposed to climate change risk, whether that's increasing sea levels or flood risk or storm damage or whatever it might be, if that's a really material potential risk to your property, then you should be managing and assessing that risk as you would any other financial risk and taking prudent steps to manage that risk. And there's nothing particularly surprising or expected to be surprising about that finding. It's just that we are starting to get more familiar with talking about climate change financial risk as one of the many financial risks that all of these individuals manage, whether you're a director or an investment manager or a trustee. So there's certainly where there's a potentially material impact, there is legally a requirement that you are considering that and taking it into account like you would any other investment. Now, the other half of the coin, which is, are you permitted to take climate change into account? Those questions started to be asked, particularly from fund managers over the last sort of 5 years or so, as fund managers and investment managers wondered whether they were able to make investments on sort of more ESG grounds or on moral grounds, or because they wanted to be sort of doing the right thing in terms of supporting a transition to a low carbon economy. And they were asking, are we permitted to move our investment in that way when doing so might have a risk of financial detriment to the performance of the fund or the performance of the investments under the trust? And that's a really tricky question, because there has been a lot of work internationally around looking at how the expectations of fiduciary duties on these different individuals are evolving as we become more aware of the risk to investment from climate change. So I want to cover that piece at the end of this session, because it's one of the interesting pieces of where this comes together. So what has changed since we did the 2019 advice, and this sort of ups the ante in terms of the context that trustee duties need to be looked at. Number one is we've had the Climate Change Commission's final advice in May, which is now being responded to by government by the end of the year. And so that really crystallises for us and for all of the investment professionals and trustees around the more particular risks to certain sectors that are coming through as a result of the Climate Change Commission's advice. So that's sort of significant feature number one. Number two is obviously the increasing knowledge on the science. So having the IPCC's sixth assessment report out and the really grave warnings in that is another really important piece of context here, and the sort of the flow down effect that has in terms of the forecast damage to New Zealand and to property and investments in New Zealand as a result of climate change, or to the way that we interact with the global economy. Number 3 is the legislation in New Zealand, which is coming through Parliament right at the moment, which is going to be requiring our larger listed issuers and also our large banks, insurers and fund managers to be disclosing their disclosing their climate-related financial risk publicly for the first time. And that legislation I'll touch on briefly as well, but that is another key development that we've had since even we published the earlier opinion in 2019. And then obviously we've had the Trusts Act and also a number of legal opinions around the world looking at these same issues, and they're all aligning around the same conclusions that we've reached under New Zealand law. So looking first at the 2019 legal opinion, for those of you on the call that are directors or fund managers as well as having a trustee capacity, where we came out on that opinion in a nutshell was that directors need to be supervising identification, assessment and decision making around climate related financial risk, and the expectation all increases as the materiality of the financial risk increases. And similarly, fund managers must be ensuring that the SIPO, the Statement of Investment Policy and Objectives that's going out to the public and marketing, is actually reflecting the investment policy that the fund manager is pursuing for the particular investment, that when you're making investment decisions, that you're taking climate risks into account in terms of looking across the breadth of your portfolio and thinking, how is my portfolio going to be affected by climate change? Is it going to have a material impact on my investments for any particular reason? And then keeping those processes live, so coming back and reviewing them regularly. And what we did after that work, because it resulted in a long opinion, which I can fully imagine people don't want to be spending time reading, is we sort of canvassed that down into a toolkit, which a lot of you will have seen through the circle, and which I would recommend if you want a sort of a short, sharp 101 on these issues, because it steps through really what a sort of a toolkit for directors in terms of what should directors focus on first, what should directors focus on in the next 5 years, and it gives you a whole bunch of questions for what actually is reasonable care for a director to take to manage climate related risk to your particular company. And that's something that we've had lots of really great feedback and engagement on. And it was as a result of this, one of the questions that came out of this was, well, what does this all mean for trustees, particularly in New Zealand, where we have such a high proportion of property held in trust? So this is the background to where we land in terms of assessing trustee duties. So if you can see the bullets on this slide, setting out some of these points I've raised in terms of what is out there that trustees should be thinking about and be aware of when they are managing these financial risks to their assets as they would manage any other financial risk. And we've talked about a lot of these. There's a lot of significant regulatory movement, and I'll touch on that in a second. There's also a lot of increasing focus from regulators around climate-related financial risk. So even though not specifically in the trustee context, more broadly, you have the RBNZ and APRA over in Australia, the FMA here, and the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, the ASX, the NZX, all of the regulatory bodies are becoming much more focused on how these risks translate for business. There's sort of a bit of a snowball effect which happens, which is that you have more litigation being brought in New Zealand and around the world focusing on challenging these kind of issues. You have more expectation from the courts, and I've put a quote from our Chief Justice actually back in 2019 where the 3 judges of our Supreme Court came out saying, look, climate change is no longer an ethical issue. It's now a material financial risk. And they were speaking particularly to directors, that you can see the sort of expectation growing in the court landscape as well. And then you have the big investor and stakeholder increasing focus as well. And why I mention all of this is that it's relevant to looking at what a court would think would be reasonable when it was assessing a potential breach of a trustee duty. Just given the timing, I'll just touch on a couple of these points on the regulatory landscape. One of the big pieces I haven't mentioned is the reform on the ETS. And what we have now is we have a Climate Change Commission which has provided advice as to what the 5-yearly greenhouse gas emissions budgets need to be for New Zealand for 5-year stages running forward through to 2050. And we've got a key net zero emissions target in our Zero Carbon Act, which in our Climate Change Response Act, which is what the Commission has been working back from in order to set its 5-yearly emissions targets. Those 5-yearly emissions budgets, which need to be adopted by the government or adjusted by the government if they wish to, although they're not intimating they're going to do that. The impact of those for the ETS is that they effectively put a cap on the ETS, and so instead of the ETS running as it has years without a lot of pressure on the amount of units that are available within the supply of that ETS to market, there's now going to be a cap on those units that will sink over time. So the amount of units in the ETS available for purchase is going to reduce with each of those 5-yearly budget periods. And what that means, of course, is that the price of those units is going to increase, and then those prices are going to get passed. Either they're going to be passed through the system to consumers, or they're going to be lead to emissions reductions by the various participants in the ETS, like the big energy sector players. And so all of that means that for anyone managing investments or property that is going to be impacted by some of those really significant ETS price rises over the next 10, 15, 20 years, it's really something which needs to be factored in and needs to be thought about in terms of the exposure that will cause. And there'll be different ways in which that intersects with different businesses, but it's another part of the puzzle that climate change is very much becoming a real financial consideration for businesses from all different angles. And that
yes. So Nicola, we've just had a really interesting question come in from Gail Ogilvie. Kia ora, Gail. Nicola, do you think that current directors and trustees in New Zealand have the expertise to govern climate change related financial risks? And if not, do we need specific intentional initiatives to address that gap?
Yeah, kia ora, Gail. It's a really good question. I think it really depends on the business and the scale of the business that you're talking about. So we are I've been speaking with a lot of the larger listed issuers that are going to have to be doing this mandatory reporting of their risk within the next couple of years. And the big energy sector businesses, of course, are, for many of them, this is part of their business day to day. They have to be across these risks anyway for part of their business, so they are obviously much better placed to be able to respond. For other, particularly the much smaller businesses that are still listed, it's a real burden for them in terms of trying to get on top of this and get on top of the science and work out what the particular risks to their business might be, because you can't just pick up a copy of what a climate risk is and apply it to your business. It really is a bespoke thing for different businesses. For some, it's the physical impacts, and for a lot of others, it's actually the transitional economic impacts, or the impact of consumer preferences changing in Europe, and that's where your products are going to, for example. So I think that one thing which is great about these sessions that Aotearoa Circle is running is that you do start to have this conversation, you can start to share ideas. And I think trustees, particularly of like smaller trusts or family trusts or trusts involving farm assets, for example, these kind of conversations are going to be relatively novel. And so it's a really good thing to be having them, because the whole intention around all of this, the messaging we're getting certainly internationally, is that it's all about understanding and appreciating your potential climate risk so that you can take steps to address it early if you need to. You don't end up with a shock later. Yeah.
Kind of building on that question, Nicola, I'm wondering, we obviously there's going to be a push towards what's expected and becoming mandatory in this space. Have you noticed an increase in appetite for people to understand this? Is it mainly going to be a push, or are you starting to see some pull in this space as well?
Yes, a bit of both. I think the snowball effect is happening as people realise that it's a good idea to do, and they realise to get on top of it, and also are being pushed to get on top of it. And so that's probably a good idea, just to flick to the new legislation that's coming through, just because this isn't specific to trustees, but it is really significant in terms of it impacting all of our, pretty much all of our large banks, all of our large insurers, all of our large fund managers are going to have to be reporting from the financial year 2023 to 2024, it's looking most likely to be, their climate-related financial risk through specific climate statements that they're going to have to file within 4 months of their balance date. So just like you do financial statements, you'll be now filing climate statements. And those climate statements have to drive off a climate standard, or refer to a climate standard, which is going to be established much like financial reporting standards are set, in this case by the External Reporting Board in Wellington. And that climate standard is going to connect to the international recommendations from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which people who are in this area hear as TCFD. Is a very regular acronym these days. But New Zealand's one of the first countries in the world to be doing this, and we've got the UK and Hong Kong hot on our heels, but we should be the first ones to have it in legislation as mandatory for all of our big listed issuers and those other entities. And so there's a real flow-on effect, because as all of our banks are required to disclose their climate-related financial risk across their lending portfolios, they are going to be wanting more information as to the risks of their individual customers. And so you can see how these questions are going to, and same with insurers, and so you can see how these questions are going to naturally flow down the chain, even if they're not specifically targeted at trustees.
Nicola, the other question that I had was around, you've talked a bit about, the risks to material investments or material assets, which makes, perfect sense in terms of, climate related risks. But in terms of understanding the real sort of expansiveness of material investments, what would you consider a non-material investment? Like, what isn't at risk here? Because my understanding is almost everything really to some degree has a material element to it, and therefore is going to be at risk as our climate changes.
Yeah, that's right, Izzy. So it really depends on the particular investment portfolio that the trust has in this case. So if it's if the trust has all of its funds invested in equities, for example, then you might be looking at that portfolio to see, if all of the trust's funds were in one particular, coal mining business, for example, then because of the regulatory reform away from coal mining and investment in coal mining, then that's a risk that you need to be, that's a really material risk to your investment portfolio. If you're much more spread and you don't have that sort of one focus in one particular share portfolio, then you might be in a much better position. But again, if you're invested overly in one sector, just in New Zealand, or if you're invested all into one family business that is going to be really impacted, then from a trustee perspective, especially if you're managing potential future generations of beneficiaries, that's when this really starts to bite from a legal perspective. And that's why I've got up on the screen now, these are the three key duties. Prudent investment is pretty easy to understand. It doesn't have to be kind of crude profit maximization, which is what came out of some of the sort of earlier cases. It's much more of a holistic, prudent, sensible investment long-term strategy. But when you couple that with the duty of impartiality as between all beneficiaries, that's where a trustee really needs to focus on being even-handed as between beneficiaries that might be taking under the trust currently and those that might be expected to take under the trust in 20, 30 years down the track. And that's where making sure that the trustees are actively thinking about whether their investments might be exposed in a way they haven't previously considered because of climate change. That's where it's really useful to have this conversation now.
And looking at these duties, Nicola, how could we expect these to shift in the future?
So again, really, really good question. So I think what we've had already is certainly a shift internationally in terms of the debate around how far these duties go and what the expectations are. And I think you can see in some of the international material that's been published by UNPRI and the UNEP FI initiative, there's a real push towards making trustees and fiduciaries more responsible in terms of taking more and more account of ESG factors in their decision making. And we have looked at the current New Zealand law as it stands. And as it stands, you would still be at risk if you as a trustee were taking a decision purely based on an ESG sort of related moral position that you anticipated the beneficiaries had, or that you had it, certainly not that you had it as a trustee, that you anticipated the beneficiaries had. If you didn't have a clear mandate to do so in the trust deed, or if you didn't have a clear mandate to do so from all of the beneficiaries, because the law is still going to protect beneficiaries from trustees just making decisions that don't have a good financial basis and are just based on their personal views. The law is still going to protect beneficiaries and question those decisions. So you have that slight tension between the law as it stands still, in particular on the cases we've had decided so far, they are more focused around protecting the beneficiaries' best financial interests. And then you have this pull from some of this international work, which is pulling us along towards saying that no, ESG factors must be considered and must be taken into account more seriously. So I think we're going to be pulled more and more in that direction. But in terms of New Zealand law to date, if I can just flick onto the next slide, this is the situation where you have a trustee wanting to do something because the beneficiaries of the trust, think it's a good idea to be investing in support of an economy that's transitioning to net zero. But there's a real risk of a material detriment to the investments in doing so. And this is where it's tricky. And what we've worked out is that where you're making a climate change aligned investment, shall we call it, that has financial benefits or that's going to mitigate financial risks to the trust, then it's likely it's going to align with the best financial interests of the beneficiaries, so you probably don't have any concern. Where your trust is prioritising the purpose or the objects of the trust is actually prioritising sustainability, or you have some sort of clear mandate from the beneficiaries to do so, then again, that's going to be likely to justify a climate change aligned investment strategy, even when you've got this risk of, serious risk of lower returns potentially. But where you have a serious financial risk, and it's not clear either in the trust or from the beneficiaries that you can go ahead in that way, then that's where you're going to be exposed as a trustee. And I think even a really, really well-intentioned trustee needs to pause and make sure that what they're doing is in the best interest of the beneficiaries over the longer term. And actually, I think practically, a lot of this is going to collapse because over the longer term, the best interest of the beneficiaries is going to be making sure that there's a prudent investment strategy that's being put in place that does, spread risk and make sure that you're not overweighted to one particular area. So I think that in practical terms, we're going to probably end up being able to take these kind of decisions with a view on the long-term interest of beneficiaries. But this is the grey area. And really interestingly, there's a UK case where a charitable trust, which obviously comes in from a different lens with a particular charitable purpose, has actually gone to the UK courts to ask the courts for guidance as to whether that trust can take investment decisions that are climate change aligned, but which are known to have a lesser, they're expected to have a lesser financial benefit to the trust. So that case is live as we speak, and will be really interesting to see whether the UK courts are going to be pulled or whether they're going to resist.
Nicola, we've got a question come in from Vic regarding your slide suggesting issues from trustees balancing a short-term return view versus the long-term. Does this also apply to directors, i.e. that given they should be acting for the company and therefore it's long-term resilience that's important?
Yeah, good question. So it's for company directors, the focus is the best interests of the company and taking reasonable care to exercise your duties in a proper way. So it's one of these things that's really hard to answer in the abstract, because you need to look at what the best interests of the company are. The courts afford directors a healthy degree of discretion in terms of assessing what those best interests are. The courts are more focused on looking at whether the process that the directors have gone through has been is justifiable, and that they've taken expert advice where needed, etc. So I think that's something that's useful to focus on in terms of a practical takeaway, which I've just put on the slide now. So key takeaways for trustees from this advice, and none of this is intended to be surprising. It's a lot of it is very much common sense, but identify if there is climate related financial risk to your particular trust property and investments. It may not be. There may be many trusts out there that are diversified, and that this is not something that is going to cause major concern for them. There may be others that have got all of their trust investments in one particular basket, which is increasingly at risk of exposure because of regulatory reforms coming through, for example. And so they're the ones that need to be really focusing on this. So then seek and act on expert advice if that's appropriate for the trust investments, and that will change for every trust, obviously, but just for trustees to turn their mind to it is really useful. And then thinking about who your beneficiaries are and whether they are just the individuals you have sort of in front of you today, or whether you are actually safeguarding the trust property for future generations or unborn generations, and are you taking that into account when you're making financial decisions, and then just being careful if you're thinking about shifting your investments purely on what might be called moral or sort of ESG focused grounds, where you don't have a really clear mandate from the beneficiaries or on the trust deed itself, because that's one area where I think it's worth trustees being cautious just before they take those decisions.
Nicola, I've got a question on that one around including future generations if appropriate, and excuse my ignorance on what does or doesn't sort of make up a trust's in that space. Is that something that is typically considered something you should be considering, or is that a sort of a new element to how trusts are structured? Because I feel like including future generations is a good way to keep that future mindset in place to what does long-term sustainable investing look like.
Yeah, so it depends how the trust has been set up. So sometimes you can have a trust that's set up for a family trust, for example, for the children and then for their children, so for the grandchildren, including grandchildren that are not yet born. And so it's those ones that are the ones that where you're thinking about the longer term financial risk. They're the ones to keep in mind. And you might say, well, hasn't this always just been the case for trustees that are managing the longer term investments generally? And I would say yes, that's absolutely right. It's really just making sure that trustees are thinking about climate related financial risk as within that bucket of the broader longer term financial risk that they're measuring and monitoring.
Amazing. Got a question here from Jackie Shen. What kind of trends are you seeing in terms of investing in companies that are already net zero versus companies who are making great efforts and moving into that direction? Supposedly it's mainly the latter. Well, that will require more funds to achieve where they need to go in the long term. Shouldn't investments be encouraged to direct their funding to these to help overall sustainability?
Yeah, so it's a good policy question, and you might say the same of government. Why isn't government funding those particular categories of investors that are making the big shifts to align their businesses in a towards a net zero carbon economy. And look, it's hard to answer in the abstract. I think the game changer really is the Climate Change Commission's advice from May, and looking at the specificity of some of the recommendations in there for particular sectors, the recommendations they've had around particular policy shifts by particular dates. We're in a slight grey area at the moment because we've got the Commission's advice, which the government has signalled it's going to take very seriously and largely follow, but we haven't had the emissions reduction plan, which is the statutory mandated response to the Climate Change Commission's advice, where the government says, yep, we've got the advice and now we're going to take these steps. We've already had some policy released, obviously, but certainly in the next 3 months, we're going to see quite a bit of policy come through from MFE, MB, MOT, other parts of government that are working through the particular implications for their sectors.
Also got a really interesting comment from Barry Coates. It's sort of talking about what isn't included within the TCFD reports, and looking at that risk analysis around some of those physical risks and material risks versus reputational risks. So yes. Do you think that the TCFD sort of analysing those reputational risks enough when it comes to ongoing investment potential?
Yes, so really good question. Thanks, Barry. It's really nice to see you here. If you look at the screen at the moment, I flicked past this earlier, but this is a really good summary of the risks and opportunities that we're talking about. So in the bottom left of the screen, you've got the physical risks, which are the ones that you can really get your arms around and understand, or we're increasingly trying to understand. But the ones in the top left, which are the transition or economic risks, these are all of the ones which stem from things like the Climate Change Commission's advice, or the changing ETS price, or the EU recently announced a carbon border adjustment mechanism where they're going to be increasing tariffs effectively on certain industries importing products into Europe if those products haven't been subject to similar stringent emissions protections, and that might be fine for certain industries, but if that type of approach is copied and expanded, say, to agricultural products, that would have a huge impact on New Zealand. And it's the kind of thing where you can just see how a regulatory change could happen relatively quickly and have a major impact on our market, which, again, it's just the more we can be across this and thinking about it early, the better. And a number of our agricultural exporters are really across this and are thinking about becoming carbon negative in terms of actually going one step further than net zero, so that they can, there's a marketing aspect for that in terms of mitigating that risk of Europe, for example, taking a position that they want to move away from, far-flung products coming in with a lot of freight emissions involved. Yeah. The other side of...
sorry, you keep going, Nicola.
I just find on Barry's question, the final part of this is the opportunity side, and we never think about the opportunities enough, but in terms of what TCFD is pushing, it's both the risk and the opportunities. So TCFD, to answer Barry's question properly, really is focused on the physical and transition risks, and the risks and the opportunities. And all of that is going to be reflected in the XRB's climate standard, which the listed issuers and banks and insurers are going to have to report against. So they're going to be naturally wanting to look for the opportunity side of this as well as the risk.
Awesome. We've got a comment from Gail, which I think just keen to get your thoughts on, Nicola. And Gail, I love this, and I know that this is something Dad would certainly get behind. And that is that the key take-home message you've mentioned is that the situations where there is a dilemma for trustees between financial gain and ESG outcomes is very short-term, as consumers, government, etc., accelerate initiatives to address climate and also nature-related issues. There will be fewer and fewer trade-off situations, i.e. i.e. looking after the environment will always make good financial sense. What are your thoughts on that, Nicola?
Yes, no, that's right. And you can see the same debates coming through in terms of the stakeholder model in the director context. So look, yes, there's a lot of discussion around that point, and I guess the really interesting piece that I'm watching is how that's reflected in legal duties, because there's certainly, in terms of where the courts, because this is going to be relevant if a beneficiary claims in litigation against a trustee for making a bad decision, or for failing to take into account climate risk, or for doing something which caused a major detriment to the trust funds, which they say was not justified because it was the trustee going and taking a moral decision which wasn't taking into account the beneficiary's best financial interests. So there is a pull between the sort of strict expectations from the legal duty, and then where I think we're seeing a lot of policy debate, and a debate in terms of best practice, or increasing expectations of how trustees and directors and fund managers might be operating. And the courts are always going to reflect those trends as they crystallize in their expectations as to what is reasonable, or what would be appropriate, or what would be prudent. And so we're in this just time of flux where what would be a prudent investment, I think, is really being impacted by the increasing focus on being aware of climate-related financial risk.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicola. I am aware of everyone's time. We've got about 4 minutes left of the session, and I know everyone is being pulled in many different directions in this lockdown and in their bubbles, from small children or large German shepherds. I think I'll give anyone a chance to just pop a final question in, or to unmute themselves and ask a question if they've got anything final pressing. But otherwise, know that this recording is going to be made available, as is the PowerPoint that Nicola has shared with us, and we'll package up the opinions that have been done as well. So anyone who is on this call will receive a bundle of all the things that Nicola has shared with us today. And Nicola, thank you so much for your time. Sorry, were you gonna?
Pleasure. No, I was just going to say that this is really just the way in which we're contributing to this discussion, and this group of people has such a wealth of knowledge, and there are so many here today who are pushing these issues forward, aside from what the strict legal position might be. So I think the intention that in terms of the circle instructing the opinion is to help push those trustees who are not thinking about this at all to say, you really need to be thinking about this. But that's almost the minimum expectation, and there are so many people going beyond that, which is really fantastic to see. So really would welcome comments. Please send me an email if you've got thoughts on this, and really interested in just the discussion that this helps create.
Absolutely. And I think in 6 months or so, if things are sort of starting to come into action, it would be great to do this again and start talking about what have we noticed in this space. So it's been an awesome forum. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much to everyone on the call. And as I mentioned at the beginning, next month we'll be doing an update on the marine adaptation strategy. So keep an eye out for registrations in your inbox over the next few weeks. So keep safe in your bubbles, everyone. Kia kaha. Thank you.